So let me tell you why we're here. I think we're here because people often feel insecure when the subject is economics or finance or money. And we're here to say you should never feel insecure. If you read a sentence that you don't understand, it's the fault of the person who wrote the sentence. It's not your fault. And it's worth remembering that jargon is essentially a tool that people use knowingly sometimes, unknowingly sometimes, to keep information from other people and to keep power within their own hands. Doctors do it, government officials do it, journalists do it, and people in finance do it. Lawyers do it. So what we want to do is try to cut through some money stuff. Peter, as you heard, spent years working on budget stuff. How many people both ran the Congressional Budget Office and were director of OMB? Are you the only one?
Two. I'm the only male.
You're the Alice
Ridley.
Alice Ridley. So head of the Congressional Budget Office is the nonpartisan group that analyzes laws. And then Peter was Obama's original budget director. If I remember correctly, you and I were having lunch on Capitol Hill when you were the head of CBO, and you started looking at your watch and said, I have to go, and you got into a black car and it whisked you away in, I think, late 2008. And I thought, I wonder where that's taking him. I believe it was taking you to Chicago for your interview with President-elect Barack Obama.
Could well have been.
So let's start actually by trying to break down some jargon in your own job. What does a vice chairman do? What is your job?
Well, there are lots of different types of vice chairmen. What I do is three different things. So I do investment banking. In fact, the reason I was delayed is I was working on the Aetna Humana deal that was just announced last night, which we could talk about. The second thing I do is that there's a group of what I call corporate finance, well, not what I call, they are corporate finance PhDs that I head. And so basically, the way to think about that group is that anything that a person with an Excel spreadsheet could not figure out analytically for a client would go to this group. And I help to kind of do quality control around that. And then the final thing is kind of potpourri, random person is coming to visit and we need someone to host them, and I'll do that too.
Okay.
Mostly the first, a little bit of the second, and then a little bit of the third.
So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a few subjects, try to have Peter explain it in plain English, and then we're going to open it up to all of you and leave a substantial amount of time for Q&A and discussion, which seems in the keeping of this. So I want to start, as some of you may have seen, this is a wonderful book by John Lanchester. He also wrote a wonderful novel called Capital that if you're looking for a good book to read this summer, I heartily recommend. I'm going to read Peter a sentence from here and ask him to translate it for us.
This is like a pop quiz, okay.
Yes, from a form of English that you read in the financial press to a form of English that people actually understand. In The Economist not long ago, I read about a German bank that had observers worried. The journalist thought that despite the worry, the bank would probably be okay because, quote, holdings of peripheral Eurozone government bonds can be gently unwound by letting them run off.
All right, now what does that mean? What that means is that bank was holding peripheral Eurozone bonds, so think Greece, for example, some bond that may not be worth as much as what it was purchased for. And instead of just going and doing a fire sale of let's just take everything that we own and try to sell it, in which case the concern would be you could drive down the price dramatically. An alternative is bonds have duration. They have their a 10-year bond or a 15-year bond, which just means after 15 years the bond redeems and it expires, if you will. So what that sentence was saying was they were going to let their holdings of these bonds run off. That means gradually decline rather than selling it dramatically in a kind of one-off type of dumping on the market by letting the bonds gradually mature and then just not buying new ones. So the bond would expire, they'd get something in return when it matured, and they would just not reinvest the funds again in those kinds of bonds. And as a result, their holdings of peripheral Eurozone bonds would gradually run off.
Okay. And so
it's
now
a fancy way of saying instead of doing a fire sale, we're just going to let this kind of gradually run down.
So now let's take that same plain-spoken approach to Greece today, which is one of the biggest stories in the news right now. So here's the way I think a lot of people understand Greece, which is The Greek government spent a lot of time being profligate and basically spending money that it didn't have. And as a result, Greece is out of money. And they need the Germans and others to give them money. And for a long time, Germany and Greece have been fighting about how much money Germany is going to give Greece. Germany keeps saying, cut your spending further and further. Greece falls further into a depression. And now what happens? So why is it that this thing that's been simmering along for so long has popped into the news right now? Was there anything wrong with my description? And what happens next?
No. So one way of maybe peeling back the onion on what's happening in Greece is to start with the most immediate and then move to lower and lower levels of explanation. The most immediate thing is people can't take out more than a small amount of cash out of an ATM, and there are constraints on other withdrawals. Now, why is that happening? And the reason that's happening is the perhaps not as well known as it should be secret of commercial banking, of retail banking, is that when you see $100 in your account balance, there's not actually $100 sitting in cash at the bank to redeem for you. Instead, what the bank will do is take your deposit of $100, and because most people don't show up and say, I want the $100 back right away, they'll take $90 of that and lend it out to a small business or to someone's mortgage or what have you, which is fine, except then the cash is not sitting there in the bank ready to be redeemed.
It's more than fine, right? The reason they can pay you interest is because they're putting that money to work.
That's the whole theory of what financial intermediation, which is another fancy term meaning we take money from you and then we guide it to more, rather than forcing you to pick out which firms you think deserve to be given credit or which mortgages you personally want to invest in beyond your own, there's someone else doing that filtering for you, and that only works with this kind of fractional banking. The problem is that also then means that if everyone shows up at one moment in time and says, I want my cash now, you have the classic example of a bank run. And in the United States, we've basically solved that problem because the Federal Reserve will provide as much cash as a bank needs to make good on its commitments to depositors. But in other situations where you don't have ready access to the cash, in this case euros, and that's going to lead us to the second and third levels, the bank won't have them there unless they're given those euros by someone else, in this case the European Central Bank. And so what's happened, the immediate forcing event for why people can't take out as much money as they want, is the European Central Bank had been saying for a while, we'll keep upping the amount of, it's called ELA or emergency lending assistance, but that doesn't matter. Just think of it as, we'll keep allowing you to borrow from us, you Greek banks, as much as you want in order to provide withdrawals or whatever else people want. They then said, we're not going to cut you off, but we're not going to keep expanding it. And all of a sudden, that meant there's a mismatch between the euros that the Greek banks have and the euros that the Greek depositors want. There's no solution to that other than saying, sorry, you can't get everything you want. So everyone gets a fixed allotment. That, however, then leads us to one layer beneath this issue, which is if the Greek central bank could just do what the Federal Reserve does and just kind of print as much money as it wanted, it wouldn't be in this situation. It can't do that because Greece is part of the euro. And that brings us to the deeper question of how did this all develop in the first place? And there are multiple ways in which you can evaluate that question. But I think the kind of truest, the most fundamental issue is that over a long period of time, Greece was tied to the euro in a way that made Greek goods increasingly less competitive in world markets. If Greek exports became more challenging to sell on a world market because the value of the Greek export was mispriced because it was being tied to.
Because Greece isn't nearly as rich as Germany, but essentially needs to have the same.
And it didn't have the same productivity growth as Germany, and so and it had a whole variety of other things going on at the same time. And yet that was like an anchor that was pulling the Greek ship down underwater. All of the other problems then became manifest when we entered the financial crisis. Greek debt exploded. lots of other problems with the ship became apparent, but the fundamental issue was the Greek economy was not growing at the same rate, and it didn't have the same productivity, it didn't have the same engine of growth as the German economy did, and yet it was tethered to that German economy in a way that doesn't make sense. And this brings us back to what most economists believe is the core problem there, which is you really only want to have one currency when either every part of that currency is kind of very much like other parts of it, which would not be Europe, or people can move easily from one part to another, so that if, for example, in Texas in the early 1980s when the oil bust happened, people left and they went to other parts of the United States, and that helped Texas re-equilibrate. If you're living in Greece and you have the same kind of problem, it's not like you're very likely to actually go move to France or to Germany or some other place, and so there's not that.
So what happens? Meaning, I feel like what you hear a lot of is, boy, this was a bad idea, it never should have happened,
Right.
but now that we're
stuck.
Undoing it would be worse, which is sort of a deeply unsatisfying argument, and yet it might be right.
I think there are many times in life when if you looked at something beforehand, it wouldn't have been wise to do, but that doesn't mean that once you're in it, you should get out of it. So it's not surprising that that happens. But
Like
I do
our
think,
healthcare system.
Like our healthcare system.
Yeah.
We wound up accidentally because of World War II, but anyway, we'll get to that later. There are one of two possibilities here, both of which I think involve the Greek government falling and some replacement coming into being. Either there is no deal reached, in which case, over the coming weeks, what will increasingly happen internally in Greece is there will be an alternative form of money that starts circulating. So when you can't get the euros out of the bank, you still need to have some way of paying for your food or paying a worker, and you make up stuff. So the government might start writing paper script. This is not a euro, but this is a promise of the Greek government. You can go cash it at your local grocery market. So there's another currency that starts coming into existence informally. And then that starts trading. You know, I'll give you 5 pieces of paper of this Greek thing for €1 and vice versa. And there's an exchange rate that starts opening up. So that's one possibility. And that usually, although not always, leads to breakage. So at some point, it just becomes increasingly untenable. And that is Greek exit, that is Greece off of the euro. At that point, by the way, it's worth pointing out that what will ultimately happen is the new Greek currency will depreciate very dramatically against the euro. And part of the recovery for Greece will come from that depreciation. It will all of a sudden be really, really cheap to take a vacation in Greece. And whatever residual Greek products can be sold on world markets will look cheaper. That helps then boost the Greek economy back out of this imbalance that is developed. So that's possibility one. Possibility two is a deal is reached. You kind of grind it out. And I should say either way, the sad part of this is an unpleasant situation for the Greek people for an extended period of time. The first one in which you have a rapidly depreciating currency, dramatic inflation is possible, and the recovery process takes a while, so that doesn't sound that appealing. And in fact, by the way, that situation is also the one that classically has led to hyperinflation, where you have a newly liberated central bank, no real tether, and you print money faster and faster and faster, trying to stabilize the situation, and there's not a good outcome there. I'm not saying that will happen, but that's a possibility. On the other side, I would say at this point, the terms that the Europeans are insisting upon after years of austerity in Greece are too onerous. They're doing that for a whole variety of different reasons. So that outcome is also not particularly pleasant. So the problem with the referendum is yes or no, they're both bad outcomes. And they may be kind of within the margin of error in terms of bad outcomes. On the second issue, people have taken some comfort from the fact that we're now in a world in which it looks like the Greek situation might be unwinding, and yet the world has not fallen apart. And that is comforting. It does suggest that most of the counterparties and other people who might be exposed if there is a Greek exit have covered their tracks. But it is also the case that you never know until you're in it, and there may be an unexpected explosion that happens 2 or 3 or 4 stages down. This entity that was interacting with the Greeks is protected, but by doing that, they didn't realize that they were laying off some of the risk to this other entity, and they weren't protected, and then they explode, and then it kind of comes back, so you don't know. The third option, which is not on the table, is either neither yes nor no, but much less onerous terms from the Europeans that gives the Greeks time to undertake a gradual recovery that will eventually happen. I mean, people don't forget that cost difference that I mentioned before that built up because they were tethered to the Germans and the Germans were being much more productive. A lot of that has been unwound because effectively there's been very steep wage reductions in Greece relative to Germany. If that continues and over time, that's a third way out. Unfortunately, the first two are not that appealing.
Right, but they're more likely to happen.
They're the only ones on the table right now.
So one more subject for me before we turn it over to other folks, the deficit. So I feel like one of the things you hear is we can't keep spending more money than we have, which is a very, logically very appealing line, and sort of is based on the notion that we are building up more and more and more of a problem with our fiscal situation. You are, I think, fundamentally more optimistic about our fiscal situation. So can you speak in plain terms for people who are not budget experts about why oh boy, at some point we can't keep spending more than we have is fundamentally the wrong way to think about the deficit today?
So this is kind of, the emperor has no clothes type of thing. But the fact of the matter is you can keep borrowing money as long as someone's willing to lend it to you at a reasonable rate. And so there's no inherent need, for example, that we need to eliminate the existing public debt as long as it's possible to keep refinancing it at a reasonable interest rate, as an example. Now, the concern becomes if you've got a dramatically high deficit, that is, you're borrowing a lot of money each year, and the amount of debt that you owe is rising rapidly. At some point, the people that are letting you borrow the money from them will say, doesn't look like such a good idea anymore. So this is partly based on the confidence that lenders have in you. It's partly based on the underlying math. But the fact of the matter is, if we are running a roughly stable deficit, so 2 to 3% of GDP, and the debt is not rising rapidly, the thought that we have to just eliminate it it's not impossible, but it seems like a very, very small risk. And what people have not appreciated is the long-term debt situation in the United States, this actually deserves much more attention, has improved dramatically over the past 5 to 10 years, and it's like no one's noticed. With all due respect to the New York Times, all the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, we'll just pick on the Wall Street Journal. All the Wall Street Journal editorials keep making it seem like we are just we're on a hockey stick of debt, like it's just exploding. And if instead you look at the official projections under reasonable assumptions at this point, it doesn't look pretty. We have run up a bunch of debt over the past few years as we went through the financial crisis. But if you look out over time, it's much more stable. It's not hockey stick. It's like we bumped up and then we're growing a little bit, but kind of stable. Or another way of putting it is the debt as a share of our economy that's projected for 2040. And by the way, immediately you should be rolling your eyes because the thought that anyone can project debt or GDP into 2040 is very suspect. But nonetheless, people do that, and it's the basis for all the scary Wall Street Journal editorials. If you look at those numbers, they're half of what they were even 5 years ago. That is, the ratio of our projected debt to our projected economy has fallen in half over the past 5 years, projected out to 2040. Why is that? The reason is that we've been experiencing just this phenomenal slowdown in healthcare costs, which is surprising to many people. It's a little less surprising to me because I stood up in public and said I thought this would happen. I have to say and was laughed at, widely mocked, I must admit, that, but it has far exceeded what I thought was possible. So as an example of that, just think about this for a second. Medicare spending last year, in total, including the spending associated with new beneficiaries and including the effects of inflation, rose by 2.8%. 2.8%. That means if you take out inflation and you take out the growth in the number of people in Medicare,
Because of the baby boomers.
Because of the baby boomers, Medicare spending per person in inflation-adjusted terms fell. And that wasn't the first year that did it. It did it the year before, too. So if I had stood up when I was CBO or OMB and I said, I have this thought, I think real per person spending in Medicare will be lower in 2014 than in 2013, literally people would have laughed at me.
Because it had never happened before,
It hasn't
right?
happened over this extended period of time. And the result of that is that the forecasters are now starting to knock down the projections even out in 2020, 2030, 2040. And one thing to know about that long-term debt is it's a little bit that we're aging and the baby boomers are retiring. It's mostly, especially over very long periods of time, that each older beneficiary is going to cost a lot more in the future than today, particularly because healthcare costs per person are projected to rise. And so if you slow that, it has a very dramatic effect on the story. I would go so far as to say if the experience that we have had, so it's not been over the past month or 2 months or 5 months, over the past 5 years in Medicare spending were to be persistent out over time, so we were to project that forward and adhere to what's happened over the past 5 years for the next 40, effectively the entire long-term fiscal problem facing the United States disappears. Not quite, but almost. It's really dramatic. And then that raises the question of why this is happening and what we can do to reinforce it, which is another topic. But it is mathematically correct that basically almost all of the long-term deficit problem would not be an issue if we could just continue what we've been doing.
Folks may want to follow up with questions about that. I think the sort of story of what has been behind the healthcare slowdown is a fascinating story. I think there's basically been a sort of quiet revolution led by doctors, led by nurses, led by people in healthcare to try to attack this. I have one sort of skeptical question about it, and then we'll turn it over to others. So it seems to me that the Affordable Care Act, which you played a big role in shaping, has all kinds of things in it that are contributing to the slowdown in healthcare. It also seems to me it has one thing in it, at least, that would push in the other direction, which is it seems to be encouraging consolidation. You mentioned that one of the things you were negotiating was this merger in the insurance business. We also see consolidation among hospitals. Yep. There are good reasons for that, right? Hospitals can be more efficient. They can do all kinds of things. But the experience with capitalism is that if you have fewer providers and more market power, you have higher prices. So how much should we worry that this increasing consolidation in the healthcare industry, driven in part by the Affordable Care Act, will unwind some of this progress on health costs in coming years?
So like most interesting questions, it depends. So for example, I sit on the board at Mount Sinai in New York, and Mount Sinai did a merger with Continuum. I have zero concern that that will drive up healthcare costs in New York City because New York City is a very competitive health market. So if you were instead in a situation in which you had 2 hospitals within 300 miles of the surrounding region, and they merged, that might be a different story because at that point they have cornered the relevant market. So it really depends region by region, area by area. Since are we off the record?
We are on the record.
We are on the record. So I would
just say what you were going to say anyway.
On the record and off the record with like this many people doesn't matter anyway, right? So, on the payer side, so that's the insurance side, it really does depend also on the market. I would say, for example, Medicare Advantage, which is one thing that insurance companies do, might be a much different market than insurance provided to companies. For a whole variety of reasons, including that it's much more regulated by the government, that there's traditional Medicare as a competitor. So if things get out of whack in Medicare Advantage, people can just flow back onto traditional Medicare, and so on and so forth. So also in that context, the consolidation effect is going to depend on exactly what you're talking about. And you can't just sort of make a blanket statement. And on the other countervailing side of things, do not forget that both for providers and payers, there is some significant efficiency benefits that come from consolidation, and they have to, on a case-by-case basis, be weighed against the cost. But for example, in the Aetna Humana deal, there will be the bankers call it synergies. Here's another term. It really means, if you have two insurance companies, and you combine them into one, you don't need two actuarial departments. You can get by with one actuarial department. And you don't need two different computer systems. You can get by with one computer system. And so the synergies are basically administrative costs that can be taken out of the system. And the key is that then gets passed on in the form of lower costs to consumers.
Right. And it seems to me part of the reason companies do deals is they think some of it will be passed on, but they can keep some of it.
But there's always a mix, and so the thought that all of the benefit goes, let's back up. If you're merging two companies, the thought that all of the benefit from that will go to company A or company B doesn't seem reasonable. The thought that all of the benefit of that would go entirely into company A and B's shareholders combined doesn't seem reasonable. The thought that it will all be translated 100% into consumers probably isn't reasonable also. The point is, if there is efficiency or value there, there's opportunity to split it up and still make the relevant parties better off.
Where prices can come down and profits can go up,
right?
With fewer departments. Okay, let's open it up to you all.
Wait, can I share my favorite part from this book too?
Please do. While we get a microphone to that unknown woman over on the right.
Some of you may be familiar. This is your book, so it doesn't have my marking in it. Some of you may be familiar with hedge funds, which have adopted this rule that I always wondered where it came from, that if the hedge fund is managing $100 of your money, they will get 2% of that each year in an administrative fee, and then they also get 20% of the profits made on investing that money. So I had no idea, where did this, it's called the 2 and 20 rule, if you ever hear that. Where did the 20% come from? So in this great book, I learned that the first real hedge fund was, this part I knew, but was founded by an investor named Alfred Winslow Jones, who had a myriad of different experiences in his life, including spending time on the sea, and he was an official observer as part of the Spanish Civil War. He got a PhD in sociology. So anyway, he had a whole variety of different things. And so he founded this first hedge fund, and the 20% of profits rule that we have is a legacy of what he decided to pay himself. And according to this book, he chose to pay himself 20% of the profits, and I'm not making this up, on the basis that this was what Phoenician sea captains paid themselves after a successful voyage. That's just awesome. So if you ever wonder...
The 2 and 20 rule is a great rule, right? Because they get 2% of your money every year no matter what, right? And then they get 20% of the profits as well. Kitty Boo.
Here's the question. I read Flash Boys this year, and Michael Lewis talked about it. One of the points he makes in that book is that Wall Street loves the fact that financial language is becoming so difficult to understand that they can do things beyond the ability of the average American to understand what on earth they're talking about. And I just wonder if you could address that, because the lexicon of business is so complicated. And the way Michael Lewis described it, the way my takeaway from that was that even Lloyd Blankfein couldn't understand what his own technology people were doing, and said they'd had that guy arrested and they had no clue how to talk to each other. I wonder if everything is getting so complicated, and how can we simplify for the American people what I couldn't tell you what a debt swap was to save my life, and can you just address the complexity, and is this actually, as Michael Lewis might explain, sort of a conspiracy?
So I think here's the thing, and I think this is actually well addressed in the How to Speak Money book. There's a mix of forces that lead to linguistic and language complexity. Part of it is what I'll call the Henry Kissinger effect, as has been noted. His brother, who spent less time in the United States than he did, came at an age at which it was harder to switch over, speaks English without an accent. He's got a very heavy accent, and when asked about it, he pointed out that it's often very convenient for no one to understand what he's saying. It adds to the kind of brilliance effect. Similarly, government officials will often classify information because they'd be embarrassed if people knew the details, and so that's just a game and a kind of complexity for its own sake. I would note that that's not specific necessarily to finance. I read a lot of academic papers where the number of acronyms and terminology and what have you seems excessive to the underlying content that's provided by that. The difficulty is it's also the case that language and technical language can be very efficient forms of communication about complicated terms. So two economists talking about a technical discussion can get to the heart of the issue much faster using the specialized terminology that's developed. The problem is that then makes it harder to kind of intervene in that conversation. And so in each setting, I think you have to weigh what I'll call the efficiency part of, the world has become more specialized, and it's not specific to finance. It's true in medicine. It's true in academia. It's true in science. And part of that involves specialized language, from the completely wasteful, just we're trying to confuse you and obfuscate. And even when it's more efficient, there is still a cost to it because it means that other people have trouble learning the new language. And that's unfortunate, but and it varies from area to area. I don't think that the author of that was the Financial Times, because of course the New York Times would have written it much better. That sentence that David started with was intentionally trying to confuse the FT readership. It instead, I think, was the thought that FT readership is a very specialized part of newspaper readership, and this was an efficient way of communicating it to them. But you can imagine in lots of other times, that's not the case. Paul Volcker used to, make an art of these, and Greenspan in particular, would make an art of these very convoluted discussions about something that if you just translated it was pretty easy on purpose because the lack of transparency was useful. And so I think, unfortunately, again, this is not a black and white issue, that in some cases the language is useful, in other cases it's obfuscating, and we just need to be cognizant that both things are going on in most cases. It's true in medicine too. Doctors will use fancy language to, dial up their perceived expertise. But it's also the case that doctors can talk to one another more efficiently with that specialized language.
I think for people who are wondering, well, what should we do about this, right? Which we all have different fields of, right?
Yeah.
I would say there are two answers. One, seek out the people who can actually explain these things in English, because they exist in every field, and the internet makes it possible to find folks, right? Sometimes it takes a while. And then, ultimately, if you can't find an explanation that makes sense to you, you probably should assume that the argument actually isn't a very good one.
I agree with both
and,
of those, yeah.
And I'll offer a bit of self-criticism in that. I and my colleagues in journalism, not all of us, but I think a bunch of us did a really good job in real time saying there was a housing bubble in this country. Right? I can give you articles that we wrote back in 2005 saying, this is crazy. What we didn't do a good job of, and what I personally didn't do a good job of, was connecting that bubble to the Wall Street bubble. And part of the reason was when we went and we interviewed people on Wall Street and we said, wait, how are you going to make money from this? They would end up using language that was so technical that we didn't understand it. And ultimately what we did is we said, you know what? They have more training than we do in this. They have real money at stake in this. Even though we don't understand it, it must make sense. And that was a real mistake on our part. And I think the lesson I've taken from that is if someone can't explain something to me in a way that I can understand it, no matter how many times I ask and no matter how many times I look for it, if ultimately it goes above my head, I'm going to decide that that argument is actually not a persuasive argument.
I was going to say two things. One is the other Michael Lewis book documented how not just journalists, but people that thought they were savvy investors basically bought the same line. So, and the other thing I'd say though is there is a role here for what David does and what I would say even the Aspen Institute and others do, which is to try to take these specialized technical worlds and then translate them. And I agree with David that if that is an impossible task, there's probably some problem in the specialized world. But it's also the case that there are many great researchers who are just not very good at explaining things.
right.
I mean, they just aren't. And they're not good teachers, but they're great researchers. And that's okay as long as we recognize the need for the translators. And that includes the upshot, and includes much of what Aspen does. It includes much of what a great teacher does, who may not be, the cutting edge researcher.
Was it the language that got people to borrow money by the state?
No, I think it was. I
think that's the veneer of the. That's a whole variety of things.
Yeah, sir. Let's wait for the microphone just so we can get it on tape as well.
I think the financial press did a real good job in terms of explaining QE, but I would love to hear what Peter would say, what the epilogue will be, when it will be written, and back to your original point, David, about the runoff of bonds. Is that how the Fed gets out of a multi-trillion-dollar balance sheet?
So first of all, you got to define QE in less than 30 seconds.
So QE is called quantitative easing, and it is an alternative to the traditional form of monetary policy easing, which is meant to boost the economy. Normally, you just try to push interest rates down. We could talk about how that's done. But if interest rates are already basically zero, you can't push them down anymore. So what else do you do? And what you can do is you can then go buy other things. In this case, for example, government bonds. You can go and buy government bonds, and what that's doing is it's injecting cash, if you want to call it that, money, into the economy and pulling bonds out of the economy. That helps boost economic activity, because in a world in which having access to cash matters, and you've already driven interest rates to zero, so you can't do anything more on that, the thought is that that helps to prime the pump of economic growth. The epilogue is going to be complicated. I think most economists believe that quantitative easing in the various rounds, QE1 and QE2, et cetera, has helped. But fundamentally, a far better approach would have been a more sustained and larger fiscal stimulus. In other words, more money coming not from the Federal Reserve, but rather from the federal and state and local governments, because the impact or the effectiveness of the monetary policy, bank shot, if you will, was positive but limited. I believe that's what the epilogue will read like. And in terms of how the Fed shrinks its balance sheet, I think it's signaled fairly clearly that what will happen is a gradual runoff, as we were discussing before, in which instead of just taking the bonds that are now at the Fed and kind of reversing the process, there will instead be a gradual decumulation.
Let's go to the back.
So I'm going to defend the Wall Street Journal in just a second.
Excellent.
A couple things that you said in the opening. You were pretty light on the Greeks in terms of how they got here. Right. I mean, and I think it's important from a policy perspective, because we're arguing about a lot of these things in this country now. And that combined with sort of lack of concern about federal debt and deficits. I mean, the Greeks got where they are, correct me if I'm wrong, because when they joined the euro, they had the ability to borrow like they were Germany, even though they weren't Germany. And they did. And they had a 30-hour work week, and they had mandatory health care, and they had minimum wage laws, and they had entitlements everywhere. And that was why they became unproductive and why no one will lend them money anymore. And when you think about the federal debt today that we have, which is $9 trillion higher than it was 8 years ago and going higher, we're in a zero interest rate environment right now, right? If we were in an interest rate environment similar to what Bill Clinton managed under, we'd be talking about how we were going to cut discretionary spending by 20% because we don't have the money. And I don't know that we're going to stay in a zero interest rate environment forever. So, I mean, when you think about the policy discussions that we've all been enjoying having for the last 3 days, I mean, there is an alternative narrative to all this. I mean, the United States credit rating got downgraded 4 years ago. And a lot of the issues that we're arguing about in terms of society's resources and how we're going to spend them are not massively dissimilar to some of the decisions that the Greeks made 15 and 20 years ago.
All right, so let's start with us, and then I'll turn back to Greece. So on us, well, first of all, it's important to realize the projections include a significant increase in interest rates. It's not like some government forecaster is sitting there thinking that rates will remain zero forever. We can debate whether they're building in enough of an increase. So that's the first point. The second point is that with regard to discretionary spending, I'd actually argue the opposite. I think that what both parties here have done is either deeply dishonest or highly problematic, because the little known secret, so let's just back up. What do we mean by discretionary spending? The budget basically has two parts. There's what's called mandatory. Those are the parts that happen automatically without any new action by Congress. So Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, what have you. That's the bulk of the budget. There's also, though, 30 to 40% of the budget, depending on the year, that is set each year by the Congress. So that's the Defense Department, it's the NIH, it's the FBI, it's sort of everything else. A traditional game that was played in budget forecasts was neither side really wanted to raise taxes that much. No one wanted to touch Social Security, and yet they didn't like the end result, 5 years out or 10 years out for what the deficit looked like. So what would they do? They'd take the part of the budget that was set each year by the Congress, and they'd say, why don't we just knock that number down on paper a bit? And it didn't really matter, because 10 years from then, Congress would come along and set that number at whatever it wanted to. So it was literally just funny money. You were just making that. And this was a game that was practiced in moderation by both parties, including, I was in the Clinton administration, including us in the Clinton administration. But over the past few years, it's gotten more and more dramatic. And then it was combined with commitments in the form of budgetary caps that meant that what was written on that piece of paper would actually be abided by. And yet no one has worked through, okay, we just agreed to this number for that kind of spending in 2020. How does that then equate to the number of aircraft carriers and battle groups and fighters, or what does that mean for the FBI's budget or the NIH budget? And I don't think that either party here can abide by the promises that they've made, the numbers on the paper that they've written down, which is why what we're seeing each year, and this gets worse and worse over time in terms of the gap between reality and paper numbers. What we've seen at the leading edge of that over the past 2 years is negotiations to not even abide by the initial part of that path, which is not surprising, but it does mean that you're probably not going to wind up where you think you are. So bottom line is, if you're worried about the deficit, which I think is a completely legitimate concern, I come back to the way to solve that, or the way to address that, is not to play paper games with discretionary spending beyond what's reasonable, although that's what both parties are doing. It is instead to move much more aggressively and firmly to perpetuate what we've been experiencing in healthcare, because nothing else, you can't cut your discretionary spending way out of a rapidly rising healthcare budget. And if you have a dramatically different trajectory for healthcare costs, the discretionary spending is kind of rounding noise. On Greece, I guess, there are different narratives that one can tell. If you look at Greek debt to share of the economy going into the financial crisis relative to other European countries, it's not like it's here and everyone else is there, even though I agree with you that there still are lots of problems with revenue collection and what have you. This is why I come back to the core problem here is the Greeks were tied to, and I'm not saying they're blameless. They have not collected the revenue they should have. They have decided they don't, a 30-hour week is perfectly acceptable and so on and so forth. It's just a different dimension, and they have borrowed too much. I agree with that also. The question is how you get out of it at this point. And just kind of slashing and cutting might be initially appealing, but I don't think it provides a good solution out of a problem, regardless of what the initial cause was.
Where else? Sir. Let's try to get in one or two more quick ones.
You're on the board, you said Mount Sinai Hospital.
Yeah.
Most New York City hospitals are profit centers, and most will not take Obamacare. Obamacare has its good points, but the problem is it doesn't not really regulate spending in the majority of health care. Most hospital, I'm a physician, most hospital charges I've seen have been just a pie in the sky, which has made the hospitals rich. Crazy spending, and most people cannot even understand their bills, and insurance companies are on that bandwagon. They pay these bills. What do you do about that when these bills are, and it's not really cost shifting because most of these hospitals won't even take Medicaid and Obamacare patients, but they come up with bills that are just incredible, way, way more than anything that makes sense on every single thing that they unbundle.
So I think there has been progress made, although we're still far from where we should be with regard to transparency of healthcare pricing. 10 years ago, it was a complete and utter disaster. Today, it's a mini disaster, and it needs to continue to improve so that you have much more clarity on what price you individually would actually pay if you were to go do X at this particular hospital. I would also note, by the way, just as a consumer, the back-end billing process also needs dramatic improvement. I mean, the number of paper bills for $12 and let alone the big ones that come from hospital systems and from part of the healthcare system is, in today's world, for lack of a better term, it's absurd. So that part does need to, and there are products out there that are starting to try to, you can go onto a website and see all your charges, pay them all at once. What a concept. With a credit card, what a concept. So both ends, the sort of having more clarity on what you pay up front and then having the back end sort of be a lot easier for you, I think need improvement. There is progress, but it's still nowhere, this is like, we moved from an F to a D-.
Kitty, this book is available in the bookstore over?
No, it's available in other Explorer.
It's available downtown and Explorer. Okay. Okay, good. I believe in ending sessions on time, so as I appreciate all the possible questions here. But thank you all for coming. Thank you, Peter.